we could begin with the question that students have asked me the most, which is, why does Putin want Ukraine back? Like, what's so important about Ukraine to Russians? And unfortunately, the answer is pretty complicated, but we can go back to the era of the Kievan Rus, as it's known. To this day, we don't even know for sure where the term Russian comes from. But the most preferred theory is that it comes from the Vikings, actually. So when we talk about the slave trade, there was a portion of the slave trade that's not particularly well known. Vikings, or Swedes, right, would come across the Baltic and they would ply the waterways of Eastern Europe. So, Kiev is on the Dnieper River, there's the Daugava and other rivers that you're going to take eventually to come over to the Volga and down. And they would, of course, bring trade goods through these waterways down to Constantinople and then, of course, later Istanbul. And one of the preferred goods actually were the people, especially beautiful young women. They were the favorites in the harems of the Middle East. And, the people of the region today are often referred to as Slavic. And the etymology of the word Slavic actually comes from slave. So the Scandinavians, the Vikings, would come down here, and they often called the people who were living in the region Ruspegar. It has something to do with the color red of their hair and their beard, whatever. And over time, it just got shortened to Rus. And some of those Vikings settled down and intermarried with locals. And in the 9th century, we get the creation of the so-called First Russian State, which is called the Kievan Rus. And the capital of that was, of course, Kiev. So the argument can be made that, in fact, the birthplace of the Russian people and the first ever Russian state goes back to the lands of present-day Ukraine, specifically Kiev. And then over time, the Mongols came in and smashed it in the 13th century, and the Kievan Rus ended. And the next Russian state was up in Novgorod in the north, and then eventually Moscow, right? And so the argument is made that maybe Putin thinks this could bolster his legacy, that he's regaining not just lost lands, but the lost birthplace of the whole Russian civilization. And it's, a very complicated story, but you could argue potentially is that simple. This area that is today Ukraine, here, ended up being shared by 3 different empires. So you had the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrian Empire. So, for example, today in West Ukraine, there's the city Lviv. And if you visit it, it feels like you're in Vienna. I mean, you can just feel the influence of Germanic culture there. And it is so different from what you're going to experience in, for example, Kharkiv in the east. So there was no Ukrainian state. Yeah, of course, they were just split between these empires. And in the 19th century, like all the other European peoples of the East, they were inspired by nationalism and wanted independence. And the first chance that they got was at the end of World War I, when the Russian Empire collapsed, the German Empire collapsed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and so did the Ottoman. So in 1918, in November, there were actually not just 1, but 2 Ukrainian states born. And it has to do with the fact that, as I just mentioned, the western portion of the Ukrainian lands was linked to Austria and the other portion to Russia. So we get the West Ukrainian People's Republic with the capital of Lviv. And in the east, the Ukrainian People's Republic, sometimes called East Ukraine, with the capital of Kiev. And these 2 states existed from November of 1918 into 1919, and both of them were brutally smashed during the Russian Civil War by the Bolsheviks, who just stamped out Ukrainian statehood. Although the Ukrainians were denied a chance of independence in 1918, 1919, they did get the USSR, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And interestingly, in Putin's long rambling speech a few nights ago, he actually blamed Vladimir Lenin for the problem of Ukrainian independence. And he said, basically, I can't believe the Bolsheviks caved on this question of nationalism and let the Ukrainians have their Soviet state. And this is what the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic looked like until the 50s. And I'll explain in a second what happened with Crimea. But then during World War II, when the Germans invaded in 1940 and pushed the Soviets out, they understood that Ukrainians had wanted independence and were denied, and they thought maybe they could use aspirations of independence to their advantage in terms of recruiting soldiers. So they said to the Ukrainian people, come on, we both share a common enemy. We both hate the Soviets. Why don't you join our cause? And we promise you can fight for your independence. So they permitted the creation of all Ukrainian regiments, where the language of command was Ukrainian, and they were part of the SS, so-called Schutzmannschaften. So they were part of the SS, right? But we need to understand these Ukrainians didn't join because they were Nazis. They also didn't like the Germans. They joined because they thought this was their chance to fight for independence. And the leader of the Ukrainian Schutzmannschaften was this man here. His name was Stepan Bandera. And ultimately, of course, it failed, right? The Ukrainians didn't get independence in the 40s during the Second World War. The Soviets came back and wiped them out again. But his attempt to lead some kind of independence movement meant that he went down in Ukrainian history as a hero, as a kind of early founding father of Ukraine. So when Putin in the news talks about the need to denazify Ukraine, he's actually speaking to a very narrow audience of people who know the intimate history of the Second World War. He's talking about Bandera. And here we have a picture actually from the Maidan Revolution in 2014. This is Maidan Square. And there you see him, Stepan Bandera, this big poster-sized picture of him. He's a hero. But Putin says he worked with the Nazis. And he and his hero Ukrainians committed crimes against humanity, which is true. When they were working alongside the SS, sometimes they were told, go to that village and round up the Jews. They did commit crimes against humanity. But that's not how the Ukrainians see them, right? That's not why he's a beloved hero. So Putin is making this bizarre claim that because of Bandera and the way Ukrainians celebrate him, that means they're all neo-Nazis, which is an absolute fabrication of history. And the last thing I'll note is that in 1954, then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who happened to be from Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, made a decision which was surprising at the time and which Putin blasted him for too in the speech. Khrushchev got the permission of the Politburo to give Crimea to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So that's how Crimea ended up joining. And then, of course, in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine kept Crimea. And much to the chagrin of Putin and other Cold War hawks. So in a nutshell, I guess that's the messy, complicated history of the birth of Ukraine.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that Putin, he's basically taking the history but speaking to a very narrow audience.
Yeah, of people his age. And that's why I struggle to understand what he's doing. I could be wrong, but I think the average Russian citizen under the age of 60, 65, do they really care about the loss of Crimea or even of Kiev? Well, sure, it's the birthplace of Russian identity, but do they really care enough to wage war over it? I mean, it remains to be seen, but I think he's speaking to a very narrow demographic group in Russia of people his age who lament. I mean, Putin has said the greatest disaster of the 20th century wasn't the Holocaust, wasn't the explosion at Chernobyl, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And to some extent, I guess it seems, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, attempting to rewrite the last 40 years of history.
What are some of the insights that you've, in your studies of Putin, that stood out to you the most about him?
Yeah, well, the first thing to note is he was a career KGB guy, and in October of 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, he was in East Germany, in Dresden, at the local headquarters of the secret police. And according to the accounts I've read, he thought he was going to die that night because the citizens of East Germany wanted access to the archives to find out, after all these years, what do the secret police have on me? And he, as the story goes, he called the Kremlin and was able to speak to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev basically said, stand down, it's over. Like, we're not gonna use brutal, deadly force to keep this thing together. And I mean, to this day, Putin hates Gorbachev. And it's interesting, I was just thinking this morning, I haven't heard anything from Gorbachev, but yeah. And so it's been said that Putin is afraid of revolutions. Very afraid, and therefore has, managed democracy to prevent any kind of dissent at home. The next thing I would say is that his health right now is unclear. There's speculation that he has some kind of degenerative disease. I've read both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and many years ago when he would speak, he was very animated with his arm gestures, and now if you notice when he talks, the one hand stays on the table. And ultimately, maybe this doesn't matter, but it's one thing that we should think about in terms of why now. Like, maybe his health really is in decline and he's nearing the end of his rule, and this is his last attempt to bolster his image as one of the great Russian leaders, who regained lost lands.
How does Putin fall in the historical list of despotic rulers in history?
I would think in this case specifically about Russian history. When I teach the history of Russia, I always use the analogy of a pendulum swinging back and forth between reform and crackdown. And it's amazing in Russian history how it does that again and again. You get one czar, right, who's all about reform. And we can think here, for example, about Alexander II of the Great Reforms, who liberated the serfs and went down in Russian history as the Great Reformer. And then the next one, Alexander III, pushed the pendulum the other way and was one of the most brutal czars, sending people to Siberia to work in penal camps. And it's this constant swinging back and forth. And Gorbachev clearly was someone who was about reform and was not going to use violence and deadly force to keep the empire together. And he really is the last, before Putin, the last significant leader of, in that case, the Soviet Union. So if we think about the pendulum, it's clear. It's moved again from Gorbachev being a kind of gentle reformer, if you want to think about him in that way, to Putin being indeed a despot. I'm thinking here of critics, like journalists who have called him out on corruption and suddenly they fall out of the window of their flat or they somehow die in a car accident.
He's been accused of poisoning some of his political enemies.
Yes, and to me the most brazen one was there was a Russian critic of his who was living in Berlin, and this person was walking through the Tiergarten in one of the most heavily trafficked parts of Berlin, and he was shot in the head in broad daylight in the park. And everyone said, there's no way that's a mere accident. He's a well-known critic of Putin's. And so Putin's FSB agents, the secret police of sorts, they're operating, in London, in Berlin, offing these people who are criticizing Putin. So I think in recent history, he's right at the top in terms of brutal, despotic rulers.
For modern day students who are most of whom were born after the fall of the Soviet Empire, can you say a little bit about the role that Gorbachev played in Soviet history? Certainly the idea of glasnost.
Yeah. I think history has not been kind to Mikhail Gorbachev. On a personal note, I wouldn't say hero, but because he did do bad things, but I admire his conviction. He genuinely believed that communism could bring about a peaceful, productive way of life. And he made clear, we've got to stop using terror. We've got to make the Soviet Union a nicer place to live. And to his credit, his reforms essentially brought down the empire. And Winston Churchill famously said during World War II, "I shall not preside over the disassemblement of the British Empire." Gorbachev said, so be it. And I think that's an amazing legacy, that you kept your convictions. And the Soviet Union was in trouble. Energy prices had plummeted in the early 80s, so maybe it would have fell anyway. But it's clear that he thought it's over and just let it go. And so I wouldn't say he single-handedly caused the demise of the Soviet Union, but his reforms certainly aided and abetted and hastened the fall. As I said, he's called it the greatest disaster of the 20th century. And the thing is, he's talked for years, for decades, about his displeasure at how the Cold War ended. But no one really took it at face value, that you would be willing to cause, God forbid, another world war over the fate of Eastern Europe. But just on a personal level, I cannot believe what's happening. I thought, if we go back to the map here, John, I thought, given the history of Ukraine, where you have these two very different portions of Ukraine, that he would take the eastern portion that historically was very Russified, and he would stop. And probably if he would have taken Luhansk and Donetsk, I'm not sure if Ukrainians in the West would have laid down their lives to defend those portions. But taking Kiev, there's no way that's not going to end in some prolonged struggle. So it's very perplexing to me what exactly he's up to.
Where does the current this current invasion or incursion or whatever you want to call it, how does that compare, say, to other Soviet or Russian wars or invasions? Like, I'm thinking specifically of Afghanistan, which of course did not end well for the Russians, for the Soviets.
Or we can even talk about more recently, in the late 90s and early 21st century, they were in the Caucasus, in places like South Ossetia, fighting against the Georgians and the Chechens. That also didn't end well. I don't, our students today are probably too young to remember, but there was a real substantial problem with Chechen terrorism in Russia a couple of decades ago as a repercussion of Russia meddling there. And maybe the worst of the terrorist incidences was the Moscow theater incident, when Chechen terrorists stormed into the theater and held everyone hostage. And Russian FSB agents thought, well, we can end this standoff. We'll put gas into the HVAC system and we'll make people go to sleep. And then we'll come in and we'll capture the terrorists. And they accidentally killed everybody in the theater. So when I think about these recent invasions, they have not gone well for the Russians. And again, you just wonder, what exactly is Putin up to in terms of how he thinks this will end? But in terms of like Russian invasions of Eastern Europe, you have to go all the way back to 1940 to make a comparison. And in that case, it meant after the initial wave of invasion, they took a few months to compile lists of people who were high-profile targets, and those people disappeared. They were either killed or sent away to gulag camps. And I'm sure you saw in the news, President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, we're pretty sure they have these lists again, and I'm target number 1 and my family is number 2. And if we go back to this image, the people who were at the leaders of the Maidan revolution are reportedly also on the list.
Should Americans be worried about where this could all lead?
Yes, unfortunately. In the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, Putin made this totally asinine demand. He said, sure, I'll back my forces up away from the border of Ukraine if all the post-Soviet states that have joined NATO agree to leave NATO. And we're talking about the entirety of Eastern Europe, excluding Ukraine, essentially. And there's no way these countries are leaving NATO. They joined of their own accord because they fear Russia. So there's this question now, what's the end game for Putin? He's now gone further than what most experts assumed, myself including. What is he after? And I listened to an interview last night with Anne Applebaum. She's one of the great living scholars on the region, writes for the Washington Post and the Atlantic, and has published 5 or 6 books on the history of Ukraine. And she was asked in the interview, what do you think Putin's end game is? And her answer was pretty alarming. She said, well, if we take him at his word, he wants to get rid of NATO in Eastern Europe. And she went as far as to say, I wonder if he might not even have his eyes on the lands of old East Germany. And at first you think that's insane, there's no way. But then you stop and think, which of the countries in Eastern Europe, including Germany, Central and Eastern Europe, which of the countries has a military that could compete with Russia? And the answer is 0. The Germans don't have any military. They've chosen since the Nazi period not to be a militarized country. And her reasoning is that Putin's calling the bluff of NATO. He thinks that the US, Britain, and France won't risk a kind of world war, won't put their soldiers' lives on the line to protect Eastern Europe. So in that case, I guess for the Europeans, the question is the Americans. If the Brits and the French maybe don't want to do it, will America come to the aid of these NATO allies? And it's interesting to remember, we are the only country that has ever invoked Article 5 in NATO, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. And we invoked it on September 12th, 2001, in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. And so what's scary is that if indeed America says we're in, then we're back to the 1980s of the two most powerful nuclear-armed countries squared off over the fate of Eastern Europe. And who would have imagined even 6 months ago that we would say that? It's shocking. And the other thing that Americans potentially, will feel the repercussions is energy prices, of course, but we also forget that Ukraine and Russia together produce somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the world's wheat. So we might also see food prices continue to climb, even at the grocery stores here, as a unfortunate consequence of what's happening.
And war.
Yeah, I mean, this is the ultimate question. If a NATO country invokes Article 5, what will happen? Just today, for the first time in the history of NATO that goes back to 1948, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary Chief of NATO, has created some kind of, I don't remember the exact title, like a rapid response force, where they've stationed troops, planes, and ships along Eastern Europe to respond very rapidly if need be. So no one knows what would happen if Article 5 is invoked, but it seems as though NATO today took a very important step toward the possibility of an actual full-scale war.
What do you say to the people in this country who say that Putin is essentially justified in going into Ukraine and claiming it as part of Russia?
I think we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to go back to a world of spheres of influence? This kind of old 19th century way of thinking? Because that's the way Putin thinks. This is Russia's sphere of influence. It is Russia's near abroad, as they like to call it. I thought we had left that in the dustbin of history, that I thought the world had decided that liberal democracy and national self-determination is the best way forward. So I think for Americans, when we try to interpret and understand the decisions made by the Biden administration, principles do matter. It's on the other side of the pond, so to speak. But this is also about the future of the world and what kind of world we want, what kind of principles we abide by, because it's clear that Putin has, since the early 21st century, been a ringleader of sorts for a group of politicians, of leaders who don't want to abide by the New World Order, if you want to call it that. And you can think about Recep Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary, to some extent Xi Jinping in China. I mean, we also have to send a message to the rest of the world that this won't be tolerated. We don't want to go back to the 19th century and early 20th century of spheres of influences and imperial warfare. We know that is not good.
How has the administration responded to this crisis?
To be totally frank, not well. And unfortunately, I think Putin here has identified an important factor. It's a midterm election year. And for example, on the question of sanctions, right? The EU has been much more aggressive in instituting and implementing sanctions against Putin, members of the Duma, the parliament, Russian companies, etc. I think the Biden administration is getting there slowly, but the fear is that, you don't want to harm yourself, particularly in an election year, by instituting sanctions that will hurt your own economy. And it's just the truth that a lot of the goods that we need to produce manufactured goods come from Russia. So for example, nickel, we need it to make batteries. Russia is the #1 producer of nickel. Palladium, we also need that for high-tech goods. Russia is the #1 producer. So it makes it complicated to implement these sanctions. I just think that we have to accept self-harm to stand by principles. The other thing that I would say that I'm a bit disappointed in terms of the Biden administration is, and obviously I'm not purview to conversations in the White House or something in terms of maybe Emmanuel Macron has told Biden, no, I'll take the lead on this one, but Biden has now given up on diplomacy. I mean, he said clearly yesterday, I'm not interested in talking to Putin. And maybe that's a good tactic, I don't know. But to his credit, Macron of France continues to have dialogue with Putin. And I think somebody has to, right? Like, you hope that through diplomacy somehow we can prevent a more wide-scale war. So I don't know. It's obviously for Biden in an election year a very tricky situation, and I think Putin knows that. I'm currently teaching a class on the history of communism and fascism in European history. And it's a class that's very focused on ideology and trying to understand the theories of communism and fascism, the worldviews of communism and fascism. And it's been very eerie teaching this class while this has unfolded, because, well, let me circle back to a phrase that's often used in Eastern Europe. This is a very well-known phrase that's centuries old. They say that the only thing certain about the future is the past will change. And when you stop and think about it, it's this really interesting idiom or phrase, and it also really encapsulates the history of the region. And so what we're seeing Putin do here is kind of relitigate the last few decades in a way that is totally reminiscent of how fascists were definitely backwards looking. So that part of it, like the worldview part of it, has been eerie, that the students are identifying, wait a minute, this is still around. And the other thing that's been, I think for the students impactful, is that they're getting a better understanding of the history of tensions between Ukraine and Russia. And I'll just go back to this map here and the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the early 1930s, when Joseph Stalin instituted collectivization in the Soviet Union, which meant, like everybody had to give up their farm and their equipment and their livestock and agree to work on a collective farm owned by the state. The people of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic were the most resistant to this, in part because they had the wealthiest farms. This is the best farmland in all of Europe. And Stalin wanted to teach them a lesson, not only to smash any hopes of Ukrainian independence, but also to say, how dare you resist my program? And he ordered a man-made famine between 1930 and 1932, 33. They sealed the borders to prevent famine refugees from leaving. And he ordered the confiscation of all their grain. And all of it left. And between 1932, 33, it was just a horrific famine. It's often now called the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian hunger famine genocide. The numbers are still disputed, but somewhere between 7 and 14 million people starved to death in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And to this very day, the Russian government will not admit that they committed genocide in Ukraine. So there's some irony with Putin talking about genocide, because that's what happened to the Ukrainians in the 30s. And it's interesting, I don't know why it took the US so long, but it wasn't until 2004 that the United States actually recognized and for the first time called it genocide. So that aspect of the course we've just been covering recently, and students were like, oh yeah, and I understand why Ukrainians don't really like Russians. They have a lot of connections professionally and personally, and so I've been emailing them just to see, how are things, and the first thing they told me is Ukrainian flags are everywhere. Everywhere. Like, people are hanging them out of the windows of their flats or apartments, right? People have them on their cars. There's a real solidarity with Ukrainians throughout the region. But at the same time, they are cursing the western part of Europe for not having the same solidarity. And my friends in the region even went so far as to basically say, those people in Western Europe, they don't care about us. They've never cared about us. They'll leave us here to get slaughtered by the Russians. The only country who might help us is the United States. And I was a little bit surprised that so soon into this crisis, they have turned to pessimism on the part of the fellow European countries. And my one friend's analysis was, Western Europe is addicted to Russian money. And at the end of the day, that's the problem. And they just don't believe that, even if they're a member of NATO, that the French or the Brits will come to their rescue. It's a bizarre world over there. When I lived in Latvia, every Sunday night there was a TV show that lasted for an hour called Degpunkt, which roughly translates like crosshairs. And literally every week, a 1-hour show devoted to the debunking of Russian fake news. There's that much of it, that every week they can find enough content to produce a 1-hour show. And this was back in 2011. So you just imagine, how it's continued to escalate. And I can't even fathom what Russians must be hearing and seeing on state-run media outlets. And I wonder what they do say about American soldiers. I have no idea, but I've always thought, since living in Latvia, the US and other parts of Europe have failed as aggressively to debunk fake news. We need a 1-hour show every week devoted to fake news and helping people, because this is the real cool thing about the show, right? Over time, if you watch it, you develop the ability to debunk the fake news. And, other than students, I hope, developing the analytical skills in college to do it, where else are they going to realize how to decipher truth from falsehood? This is another thing about Putin. Like, when you stop and think about like the big picture of what he's been doing over the last 20 plus years, hard to say. Like, maybe this is one grand scheme, where he's like, let's let all this fake news percolate for about 20 years and then maybe we'll do something. Like, it's just not clear, but it's a major problem.
Is there any particular reason why he's invading Ukraine now? You mentioned the midterm elections.
Yeah. So my only possible explanations are threefold. The first one, obviously, it's a midterm election, so that's timing-wise good for Russia in terms of putting the US in a bind. Secondly, Putin's health it's not clear what's going on there. And then thirdly, the President Volodymyr Zelensky, he's an interesting character. I don't know if you know his history. He's an actor. He rose to fame in Ukraine playing in this TV show about a guy who runs for president not wanting to win, and he suddenly wins. And there's like bizarre parallels maybe with Trump, but he wins and he's just like a regular guy, and then he has to figure out how to be president. And this was a wildly popular show in Ukraine. And then he realized, hey, I think I could actually win the real presidency. And so he ran and he won. And people thought, like, this guy's a joke. But I have to say, he's been really impressive over the last year or so. And it's clear he's serious about it. Like, he really wants well for Ukraine. And this is my third possible explanation. I think maybe Putin realizes this guy's no joke. They actually like him. And he's probably going to take Ukraine even more toward maybe joining NATO, maybe joining the EU, and possibly this is Putin's attempt to prevent that from happening.